So my name is Dan O'Farron, and by trade I am a software engineer. I've been working software and visualizations for basically my entire career. For most of my career, I've been involved in making visualizations of graphs, nodes and lines and the things connecting those. So when I learned about Bitcoin and I looked into the technology behind it, naturally I was immediately drawn to what the graph might look like. And so I wrote a little program about a year ago, and I've recently released a public version of it on my website, numisite.com, the Numisite Bitcoin Explorer. And I visualize the transactions for the Bitcoin network. So I need the clicker. So next slide. So when visualizing transactions and looking at stuff that's on the blockchain, something that needs to be talked about it's just the elephant in the room, and it has to be addressed, and that's the issue of privacy. When you're putting in transactions on the Bitcoin network, it's almost like you're writing Billy Bob Loves Charmaine on the town water tower. I mean, you can't get upset when people read it. So what Bitcoin does to get away with it, to make it a little less intrusive, is they do it in numbers and they do it in codes. And Satoshi realized this risk when he did this in the beginning. So the second best thing you can do to preserve your Bitcoin privacy is do not reuse your private addresses. And he devoted an entire section of privacy in his white paper about this. And even with using that golden recommendation, there's still some linking that can be done through analyzing the transaction structures. However, he was a bit too assertive in his privacy risks, because there are some things that didn't turn out to be true. Gregory Maxwell worked with a process called CoinJoin, where the one assumption that all the inputs to a transaction are controlled by the same party has been proven false. Each input can be independently controlled. However, predominantly that is true, but it's not always true. So there is ways to preserve your privacy. Now, the worst thing you can do for keeping privacy on the blockchain is to put your transactions on CNN during prime time, like Morgan Spurlock did. Here's Morgan Spurlock. He's buying a pizza with a QR code. And from that QR code and the amount of Bitcoin that he used to purchase that pizza, I was able to find the wallet that he used for the entire episode and track down all but one or two of the transactions on there. And not only that, he violated the second great rule of privacy. He reused his Bitcoin address across all of the wallet. So it's really easy to pick apart all the stuff that he did there. He violated two of the great rules of privacy if you want to keep your transactions private. Of course, he's doing a CNN show, so he probably didn't want them to be that private. Now, this is a graph that you're going to see that's going to be typical for the rest of this presentation. And in this, the rectangles represent the actual Bitcoin transactions. The lines between them represent the transaction outputs. Time goes down as you go down the graph. The transactions above come before the transactions on the bottom. So the transaction inputs come into the top of the rectangle, and the transaction outputs go out the bottom of the rectangle. And this is relative. Just because a transaction is in the same row does not mean it occurred at the same time, merely that it occurred before the transaction that it is connected to. Now, this transaction represents the most common type of a transaction you'll see on the Bitcoin blockchain, and that is of a Peel transaction. There's two separate instances of a Peel transaction, and these were the first two Bitcoin transactions that Morgan Spurlock participated in. When he got his Aegis wallet, he received about 4 millibits, which represented about a quarter at the time. And then later on that night at the New York Bitcoin Center, he bought a full Bitcoin from one of the traders on the floor, and that second transaction represents the 1 Bitcoin that Morgan Spurlock received. Now, what happened is the people providing these, they did something they called peeling off the value of the Bitcoin. They took the entire transaction value. In the case of the quarter, there was only 1 input. In the case of the full Bitcoin he bought, there were 2 inputs. And those were peeled off into Morgan Spurlock. And then the change address goes to the people who are originating the transaction. Now, one of the things about Bitcoin transactions is that the entire input is completely consumed in the transaction. So if you want to keep your value, you need to put it somewhere else, because any outputs that are not claimed in the transaction are claimed by the miner as a mining fee. So you want to be sure that you send your unused portions of your transaction input somewhere, or the miner is going to claim it for you. In this case, this is the change address. These change addresses happen to be in these two transactions as the rightmost output of these two transactions. Now, an interesting thing happens with these change addresses. They become inputs to other transactions that an individual will do the next time, and these chain together. They form what's called a peeling chain. This was first identified by Sarah Mickeljohn when she was researching at University of California, San Diego. I believe she currently works at UCL. I might be wrong on that, but I think that's where she's currently at. But in this case, this is Morgan Spurlock further down in his wallet. He peeled off 3 different values to 3 different places he spent his money. And the output chained together into the next transaction. He peeled off 8 millibits and then 6 and some odd millibits and then 6 millibits again in succession over the course of a day. And these transactions, they form this nice peel chain. This is one of the shorter ones. I didn't put the longest one on there because I wanted it to be nice and readable for the conference slides. I've seen out there transaction peel chains that are hundreds, and I think there's some out there that number into the thousands that are ridiculously long. But this is the most common multi-transactional pattern that you will see on the blockchain. Now the second most common single transaction pattern that you will see is what I call the sweep transaction. That's where you take all of your little tiny Bitcoin outputs and you sweep them together into one output. If we zoom in on this, we can see that this one had 31 inputs in one output. At the time that this transaction was done, that represented about 2,000 Bitcoins or so. I mean, $2,000 in Bitcoins at that time. So they're consolidating a lot of value into one Bitcoin output. Now, one of the things you'll notice about this is immediately he goes down in the next transaction. I'm presuming that the controller that controlled the inputs as the outputs was the same person. This is typically the case, not always in a sweep transaction, but typically you sweep it into your own wallet. And in this case, he is sweeping it, the controller is sweeping it directly into their transaction. Could be a she for all I know. I should use the gender neutral it for this. But the controller swept it out. But sometimes you can do these transactions into the same transaction. Here we're back to the pizza place that Morgan Spurlock purchased his pizza from. He did it twice, once for camera and once to eat. And he also purchased some at a grocery store next door, and he purchased some Bitcoins. He didn't purchase Bitcoins, he purchased a massage with Bitcoins. And it looked like they were all from the same vendor because they're all using the same transaction address. Again, major privacy violation. Please don't do that unless you want people reading your transactions. And so they took 11 of these transactions, swept them together, and then they peeled them out of the next transaction. And in this we see the controller of whoever was doing the payment processing for those particular shops is engaging in the same peeling transaction. But this is another kind of a Bitcoin transaction out there, which is called the self-spending transaction. That's where one of the outputs matches one of the input addresses. So it's really easy for these transactions to figure out which one of the addresses is indeed the change address. In these cases, it usually lines up with the input address. So we can tell that they're spending off 428 millibits off to one and then 382 millibits to someone else. And we can figure out fairly easy which one is the change address. Now, I'm going to jump away from this for a little bit and talk about something else. I mentioned Gregory Maxwell earlier and what he put together called a coin join. And what those form is basically they take their transactions and they smash them together in one transaction. Now, this is the smallest possible coin join that I've been able to find on the blockchain. And it consists of 2 relay transactions, basically a transaction with a single output and a single input. And they smashed it together into one transaction. This could be a joint. I actually believe it's one controller of the inputs and the outputs, actually just the inputs. But this could be 2 separate controllers controlling both of the inputs. Because the important thing is you could separate this transaction into 2 separate transactions and still have standalone transactions. So that's the hallmark of a joint transaction. And this is typically what you see in CoinJoin, because typically on the network people have their own transactions. They just join in together with other people's transactions. Now, when evaluating these Bitcoin transaction network, these Bitcoin transactions, came to the conclusion that most Bitcoin transactions group together in multiple Bitcoin networks where they have multiple transactions involved. So in my paper, I briefly addressed the notion of a transaction network. Typically, this might be a wallet, is the canonical transaction network. But there's also some other sorts of variations of people who might, of transaction networks that might want to be analyzed. Coins that belong to an individual across multiple wallets. Coins that belong to a corporation might be a theme joining these transaction networks. A coin join cloud is a type of a transaction network where there are multiple controllers in it, and yet it contains the same theme or aspect. And also tipping, we see some tipping chains that grow together. And also the hot wallets and the cold wallets, I prefer to call them the operational and the storage wallets of an exchange, also exhibit some unique behaviors that are separate just from the ownership of the corporation. Here's one example of a transaction. Oh, and for time, I'll skip over this slide. You can read the paper to read the gory details of how I tear apart what a particular transaction network is. Generally identify them by the transaction inputs and outputs, not by the transactions themselves. So here's an example of one of the more esoteric, well, not esoteric, but one of the more common transaction networks that you would want to analyze as a group of transactions rather than an individual transaction. And this is, I believe this is a shared coin mixing cloud. I'm not entirely certain about this, but it certainly is a coin join style mixing cloud where the people are taking in their various large Bitcoins and they're mixing them together, tumbling through a few steps and taking them out. The top left transaction is one coin that is entering the network, and the top right represents the existing part of the cloud. And then it steps through the two purple transactions, which are the focus of this particular slide. And then I identified 3 exit coins of coins that I believe are exiting the Tumbler cloud network. Now, this is not an entire Tumbler cloud. If we expand just the 2 Bitcoin transactions in purple, we get a very large and confusing diagram. And quite honestly, this is the point of a coin join mixer cloud, is it makes it, to the casual observer, impossible to figure out, and to the dedicated algorithmic observer, incredibly difficult to figure out. In fact, there's so many inputs and outputs on some of these that to pick apart the individual transactions is generally computationally infeasible. Now here is another type of a multiple transaction network that I think is one of the more interesting ones. I call this tunneling, and I name it after quantum tunneling. What happened in these 2 transactions is someone put in 100 millibits into an exchange, put it into their hot wallet, and then they walked away for a few months, came back a few months later, and asked for those 100 millibits back. Now, this is like a bank. It's like when you go into a bank and you put a $5 bill in, you don't expect the bank, when you come back 2 months later, to give you back the exact same $5 bill. However, in this transaction, these are actually connected transactions. They have meaning. The dotted line I put in there is not represented by anything on the Bitcoin blockchain. It is actually represented by information stored by the exchange that is holding the custodial holdings for these accounts. And that dashed line represents a phantom coin, which is the 4th kind of a transaction connection that I discovered while looking through these transaction networks. So in conclusion, quick thing about privacy is more than just simply the data that you have. It's more than just your ultimate balance. It's more than just your the addresses that you might be holding your Bitcoins. It's also about the context and the arrangement of the data around it and all the metadata. One of the things is you need to be careful of is that other people's poor privacy practices might impact you because they might be engaging in practices that might reveal their information. And if they do something like post themselves buying a Bitcoin pizza on CNN, all of a sudden their bad privacy practices can leak into yours and people can start analyzing your transactions simply by the context of the transactions around it and the transactional patterns that are put in there. So if there's one thing that you take away from this talk, is that if you can use a new address for every transaction, you absolutely should. I have time for a few questions, I believe. Yes?
I watched the Morgan Spurlock on Bitcoin. I thought it was great, but he's a newbie. So
Microphone.
a newbie with a smartphone traveling around How would a newbie traveling around with their smartphone be able to change their wallet address quickly and easily going from place to place? Especially, like I said, someone who's relatively new to Bitcoin.
Right. And at the time, the state of the art of wallets was to use one address or to change on demand. The thing to look for is a hierarchical deterministic wallet or an HD wallet. Those are the wallets that use the bit protocols that create a new key for every transaction in a deterministic fashion. You keep the secret values, and you can figure out which addresses your coins would go into, and you would know that. But to the world, you're using a new transaction each and every time.
I won't monopolize this, but can you give us an example of an app like that?
The name escapes me. I have the source code on my Breadwitz. Airbits, Bread Wallet, any other from the audience? Mycelium. Ask around. All the Bitcoin professionals know exactly what all these are. The more common ones that are the ones that persist and gain new customers tend to be the ones that support this HD. So a newer one would be better. All right, thanks.